How many year-end lists have you read in the last few weeks? Too many, someone said him. How many top 10 lists from the decade that just ended? I don't know about your reading piles, mine's about way big. Reflections on the changes, the good, the bad, the you name it. I've been reading and reading and reading. Time Magazine, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, New York Magazine, all sorts of things that come in my email box. Indeed, so someone said, perhaps too many. But it's interesting. There are more than I can read and perhaps even reflect on, but as this is the first Shabbat of 2020, I'm going to take a few select ones and look back with you, even as we look ahead in this first Shabbat of January. Some of you may have seen the Year in Pictures. It's a beautiful color section. My favorite picture in that section, I think, was that had portraits of the many and diverse women of the 116th Congress. And if you saw the pictures last January, so many of them dressed with color and with style and even showing their ethnic background, so different than the dark suits of the past. Another picture in that section was maybe not so peaceful, but it looked peaceful, was a wind-free picture of Lake Michigan during last winter's polar vortex. It didn't look quite as cold in the picture. My least favorite picture in that section is that of children in the water in the Rio Grande as they tried to cross the border. There were two other challenging moments and experiences in that section. We saw images of children imprisoned in Syria, the Amazon and Notre Dame Cathedral burning, Robert Mueller exiting the House Judiciary Committee hearing, atrocities in Syria, Brexit protesters, and more. Then you may have seen the Times Tech Review. Do you realize that in 2010, Steve Jobs unveiled the iPad? How many of you couldn't function without it? There was a gasp in my house when my kids realized that year. In 2010, Steve Jobs unveiled the iPad, and social media fueled the Arab Spring. In 2016, Facebook and other social media impacted the election. And then there was streaming. Okay, how many people have binge-watched a show in the last week? Be honest. Yeah, there's some hands up top, too. In 2019, Uber went public, and Mark Zuckerberg said that Facebook wouldn't fact-check political ads. New York Magazine asked the question, who were the 2010s? They interviewed a number of different people. One of them was Ta-Nehisi Coates, who reflected on his 2014 Atlantic essay called The Case for Reparations. He reflected as well on the impact of race in politics. And a few pages later, we read about a powerful voice in the Black Lives Matter social movement. From another vantage, if you looked at, there was a section, almost looked like a yearbook page called Notable Deaths of 2019. Who recalls Birch Bayh? Senator from Indiana. Do you know that it was Birch Bayh? I didn't know this. I remember hearing him speak as a child, but he drove the Title IX legislation. Right? Title IX legislation, you may recall, prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in educational institutions, though it's probably best known for its impact on high school and collegiate athletics. Among those other notable deaths, Ruth Abrams. She was the first female justice in the Massachusetts Supreme Court. I had never heard of her. Sarah Danius, the first woman to head the Nobel Literature Board. And Carol Spinney. Who knows who Carol Spinney was? Big Bird and Oscar. Carol Spinney was Big Bird. If you haven't seen the documentary on him, you should see it. He was Big Bird and Oscar from the inception of Sesame Street in 1969 until 2018. As well, we saw the death of three-time Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Arens. Then, if you turn to another section, for me, it's one of the most awaited sections of it was the year-end New York Times Magazine section called The Lives They Lived. We read of well-known folks like Doris Day and Harold Bloom. Anyone ever hear of Unta Blackwell? about Enter Blackwell? In 1964, she was a 31-year-old woman in Mayersville, Mississippi, with an 8th grade education. She encountered Northern college students there for a Freedom Summer, and she was inspired. She tried to register to vote, and from there began a life of public service, starting with the voting, recruiting others to vote, and then she was the first Black female mayor in Mississippi, a role she had held for 20 years. Reflecting on these people and events is a good exercise. I find it fascinating to read about people's lives, but I think there's more to it than that. If we look back in the last year and the last decade, we can think about what disturbed us and what inspired us. We may have reacted with awe or with concern. Ultimately, our reactions can cause us to look ahead with new or renewed commitment in this new year, to think about that which is important to us. So as I invite you this Shabbat to do just that, to take time to reflect on that which you've read, or you could still read, many lists still floating around, I leave you with one more year-end story. Anyone read Time magazine, their person of the year? I was combing the grocery stores last week. They chose Greta, I'm going to try to pronounce it right, Greta Thunberg. As you may have seen, they chose someone who is not a leader of a political party, not the leader of an advocacy group. Well, she is actually now the head of an advocacy movement. She has no access to traditional levers of influence, and she's not a billionaire. She's not even an adult. She's 16 years old. She's an ordinary teenage girl who, in summoning the courage to speak truth to power, has already become the icon of a generation. Greta Thunberg is a teenager, as many of you know, who became worried about the climate crisis. So she began protesting. She took a day off from school, much to her parents' concern, and from there went and camped out in front of the Swedish parliament, holding a sign that said, "School strike for climate." In the 16 months since, she's met with heads of state, addressed world leaders at Davos, and inspired 4 million people. 4 million people to join the global climate strike on September 20th. She's inspired kids, she's inspired adults, and because of her, climate strikes have been held across the globe. Governments and companies are committing to action, and ordinary people, like us, are following her example, changing their behavior to protect the environment. I leave you with her story after a glimpse into very few of the highlights and lowlights of the last year and decade with a purpose. For we can, each of us, choose to focus on what overwhelms us, and I don't mean just the lists. As Rabbi Daniels mentioned, the difficult parts of our world. Or we can look at the achievements of so many, including those of a teenager who's mobilizing the world, and we can be inspired. We can be inspired to begin action. And remember, as we sung at the beginning of our service, after Kendra Goldstein stole my thunder there, but thank you, that we are not required to complete the work, but we're not free to desist from it. We have to start. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, v'lo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena. We don't have to finish the work, but we've got to start it. Each of us can determine the work that we take on the new year, who challenges us, who inspires us. But let's do it. And lest we be overwhelmed and not sure when to start, let's also hear the words of our great sage Hillel, who asked, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? If not now, when?" Indeed, if not now, when?
Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, lo alecha ligmor, lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, lo alecha ligmor, velo ata ben chorin lehabatel mimena, velo ata ben chorin אתה בן קוראים. לא עליך הלכה לגמור, לא עליך לגמור, לא עליך הלכה לגמור, לא עליך לגמור, ולא אתה בן קוראים להיבטל ממנה, ולא אתה בן קוראים, ולא אתה בן קוראים להיבטל ממנה, ולא אתה בן קוראים.
We are not obligated to complete the work, neither are we free to desist from it.